So yesterday we talked about adaptations. Today we're going to talk about species, which are the fundamental units of evolution. And as I said, many of you have probably been taught that populations are the fundamental units of evolution, not species. And you may also have been taught that species are not real. And I'm going to try to attempt to show you that in fact species are, not only they are real, but the species are more fundamental units than populations. And population biologists in fact understand that because single populations are not self-sustaining without recombination and interbreeding and gene flow among populations. So there must be some fundamental unit that involves groups of populations. So even population geneticists who say that populations are real and species are not have a research program that's based on the assumption that there is some grouping of populations above the level of populations that is real and important evolutionarily. So we can just get by that. All this conflict between population biology and systematics is just sociology. It's just competition for research funds in space and journals. It doesn't have anything to do with the reality of studying evolutionary biology or the reality of the structure of the biosphere. Now, human beings have, looking at nature, have always noticed a couple of things. The first is that there are lots of creatures on this planet. There's an enormous amount of diversity in the living world. So that's one of the things that we have noticed. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is where do these things come from? What are they and where do they come from? Now yesterday we talked about the other observation that human beings have long made, which is all those species that are out there seem to come equipped with the ability to take care of themselves. They seem to have what they need to survive. They have these functions, these adaptations, that have some correlation between where they live and what they do and what they need to survive. And that's what we talked about yesterday. But today I'm going to talk about the nature of those fundamental units, the species that carry those adaptations. Now in the past, there were a lot of different explanations for the existence of this amazing biological diversity. Many different species, and each of those species with the capacity to survive and to act in their own behalf. And what's really interesting about this diversity of human religious beliefs, human philosophical beliefs about the nature of the world, is that with respect to the biosphere, all of these religions believe in or are fundamentally about organic stasis. Even religions that appear to have an evolutionary basis to their ontology, that they believe that the nature of the world has changed, they do not believe that that applies to the biosphere. And many of the religions that have embedded within them a notion of change have only a notion of time going in a circle. So for example, in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, time progresses, but it goes in a circle. It's just endlessly, everything is endlessly being recycled. So with respect to individual species, there is not a sense that one can change into another, or one can transform itself. So all of these religious beliefs accepted the biosphere as we knew it as given and static. This is the way it is, this is the way it was, this is the way it will always be. And part of the reason for that was because we wanted the biosphere to be like the way we tried to view the entire world. The nature of living things was the same as the nature of the universe at large. Because we had a lot of these essential parts of the world. So in early classical Greek philosophy, there were four elements, four essences in the world. Fire, water, earth, and air. Earth, wind, and fire, as a popular band from my day was called. Now, of course, we have advanced. We have fire, water, earth, wood, and metal, also as an essential element of the existence of the world. one of the strong believers in a static cosmos, a static universe, was Plato back home. And the main reason that Plato wanted the world to be static was because Plato had a political agenda that was based on absolute authority at the top and unthinking, unquestioning obedience by the people underneath. So he had a particular political agenda that was based on the notion that nothing should change. He also believed that any time human beings tried to change something, that's going out. There we go.
Okay. Thank you. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah?
Just give it to him. I think it just reduced the volume.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry, that time I was going deaf. Okay, so Plato believed in this idea. It's interesting that a lot of evangelical Christians, right-wing evangelical Christians in the United States, and unfortunately this is one of America's more common but unpopular exports to the rest of the world, the evangelical Christians actually do not have a Christian theology. They have a Platonic essentialist theology, in which they believe, like Plato, that the world was, once upon a time, the world was created perfect. And it has been getting worse and worse ever since. And everything that human beings do that changes the way the original perfection was makes things worse and worse and worse. And that's why there's a strong connection between political conservatism and religious evangelism in the United States and other countries. This is this notion that everything we do makes things worse. So just stop doing anything. Okay. So, for example, recently in Hungary, the country of Hungary, there are only 10 million people in the country. A petition signed by 100,000 Hungarian women was presented to the Hungarian parliament about 3 weeks ago, asking that the parliament pass the first law in the history of Hungary that would make domestic violence part of the criminal code. If you beat your wife in Hungary today, you have not committed a crime. It's not even as bad as parking in the wrong place on the street. There's just simply no crime. So this was a request that a law be made about this. And one of the members of the Hungarian parliament stood up and said publicly, if Hungarian women would stop trying to work and go back home and have more babies, there would be no domestic violence in this country. That's a static view of the world. That's Platonic essentialism. Let's go back to the way it was. It's sometimes now, this kind of attitude is called a nostalgia for a past that never existed. Because in fact, there's no evidence that the world ever was in the state that Plato imagined it was. So what he was trying to do was to convince people that once upon a time in the past the world was perfect. He knows what that perfection looked like. So if you just follow his ideas, we'll go back to the way it was and everything was perfect. But in fact, it never was that way in the past. And so philosophers and politicians would always point to the natural world as an example of this unchanging perfection. Because you could see species out there that were, quote unquote, perfectly adapted to their surroundings, and they were the same year after year after year. So that's how we got this idea that somehow stasis was the nature of the universe, and that was a good thing. And so one of the things that led to was this quest to find the few powerful, unchanging universal laws of the universe. And you can find that in a lot of mathematical formulas. And the assumption was that what was good for understanding the radius and circumference of a circle could also be applied to Max the cat. And that is a fine looking cat. I'll tell you, that cat had a long, wonderful 21-year life, and I still miss her. He doesn't miss me. He's off in some other universe having a really good time. He's now in a universe where the mouse never escapes. Aristotle came along. Aristotle was a student of, okay. But Aristotle had a slightly different view of things. And Aristotle actually was the first person to begin to see that there was going to be a different way of viewing the natural world. And initially this came in his insights about the relationship between Greeks and other human beings. Now Plato divided the world of humans into Greeks and barbarians. And Aristotle said, well, okay, I can see the Greeks are a real group, but it's really not right to classify all the rest of the human beings as barbarians, because not all of those barbarians are the same. Some of them have no code of morals at all, and some of them actually have a code of morals. And in fact, some of them have morals that are not too dissimilar from the Greeks. So, we can't just take Greeks and non-Greeks and say that those are two equally valid taxonomic groupings. And that was the first time that people began to think that maybe X and not X was not the nature of the world, that the world wasn't divided into a whole lot of binary choices, that maybe included in not X were a whole lot of complicated kinds of things. And Aristotle was a really good biologist as well, or perhaps he became interested in biological classification as a result of thinking about Greeks and barbarians. But one of the things he did was not to try to say what the essence of species was. This is essentially a bird. This is essentially a mammal. All right, mammals have hair, birds have feathers, this sort of thing. So his classification of the natural world was the first classification based on the characteristics of the organisms, not what human beings thought was the significance of the organisms based on their own philosophical beliefs. However, his scala naturae, or great chain of being, his classification was still linear and static. It was interesting. It was complicated. It started with formless matter. Okay, formless matter. Okay, now today we understand that formless matter is an oxymoron. But that's okay. He didn't know everything. And you have rocks and plants. Okay? So plants came first. And then all this stuff. And you can see this is sort of a simple to complex thing. It's based on the assumption that plants came first and then animals came and so on. And in fact, some of those ideas about the origin of life and the early evolution of life are still in textbooks today. And they're Aristotelian, they're not evolutionary. And remember yesterday I said that Aristotle originally classified animals into two groups, those with blood and those without blood. Now many of you understand that these things all have blood, so we don't worry about it. But he didn't know everything. His microscopes were not that good. His sequencers were really slow. But this was his classification of organisms. Now he classified organisms on the basis of characteristics, but he explained them on the basis of what he thought were essential attributes, the meaning of the organisms. So this was an attempt to combine what organisms look like with what they meant, what their significance was. But it's still static. And he has groupings, but they're not, it's not in any way, shape, or form phylogenetic. And you notice up here that you have humans, and then up here you have spirit. That's, of course, where all the philosophers were. And that's one of the problems we have with a lot of these kinds of writings over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, including religious writings, is somehow the people who are writing the books end up being at the top of the list. And that's partly because these kinds of classifications are static. They're not evolutionary. So you're not allowed to say, these two things are different, isn't that interesting? You have to say, these two things are different, which one is better? Or which one is more important? Which one is more efficient? Which one is better adapted? And that would be like saying, let's go into a tide pool and ask which of the thousands of organisms we find in that tide pool is better adapted to living in a tide pool. Which is better adapted, a crab or a polychaete? That's a silly question. We would not ask that question today because we live in an evolutionary world. But at one time, that was a perfectly legitimate question to ask. Now, Aristotle's plan, Aristotle's view, led to almost 2,000 years of describing species with the idea that these would all be placed into that great chain of being, that scala naturae. So you could describe species forever and ever without being evolutionary. And in fact, as I said yesterday, taxonomy didn't join the Darwinian revolution until the 1960s, until the advent of phylogenetic systematics. John Ray, in the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, was the first modern naturalist, first modern natural philosopher to actually articulate a species concept. He published a book of plant classification. And interestingly enough, he said that species are things that perpetuate themselves. So there are two things about this. The first is that this is the first time that species are recognized on the basis of not only their own properties, their own static properties, but on relationships through time. And this is also the first formulation of what we now call the biological species concept. So those of you who've been taught that Ernst Mayr invented the biological species concept, wrong. Only Ernst Mayr believed that, and he's dead, so it doesn't matter. The problem is that he also believed that species were static, and what reproduction did was preserve the species permanently. And 50 years later, Linnaeus came along. 1753, he published his own classifications of plants, and 5 years later, he produced the classic 10th edition of his classification of life. Linnaeus did a couple of things that were really important. The most important thing that he did was simplify the naming of species. Now, this little plant, which we call the winter cherry, before Linnaeus, the scientific name of that species was this. And those of you who are having a hard time dealing with remembering all those names, it could have been a lot worse. It was a lot worse. And thanks to this guy, this Swedish guy with a French name and interesting fashion taste, is responsible for making sure that you only need to know two names instead of 12,000. Imagine what the name for human beings must have been. Lots and lots of superlatives at the end, exalted, most intelligent, close to God, blah, 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 blah. Homo sapiens is a lot easier to remember, even if we're not actually sapiens, we just say we are. So he not only simplified the naming, but he made that popular. He said, look, he proposed this simplified naming system, but he made the scientific community adopt it. And that's really critical. So, and he did this by classifying species into internested sets. And what he discovered was that you could compress an enormous amount of information into a fairly compact description by classifying that way. He did not ask why classifying things in that way was so natural and why it worked so well. He didn't ask why it was that this was the most efficient way to classify species according to characteristics that they shared. And he could have proposed a periodic table of species, for example. Now, a periodic table of elements is the most informative and most efficient way to classify the elements. A phylogenetic tree or an internastic classification of elements would not work as well as the periodic table. That's because elements aren't evolutionary. A periodic table of species doesn't work as well. It's not as efficient at representing information as an internested classification. That's because because species are related by evolution. But Linnaeus did not ask that question. He just accepted this as being the way it was. And it worked really well. It was a very efficient classification system. If you know that these members of the original Star Trek are classified this way, you can tell a lot about their characteristics. But it was still a static kind of thing. So he agreed, got the scientific community to agree how to describe and name species, how to group them, but this was his explanation for how we got species in the first place. It's the way God wanted it. Who are we to question it? In fact, that was an argument I heard on National Public Radio yesterday. There was a discussion in the state of Maryland in 2 weeks in the election. There's going to be a vote in Maryland, and people in the state of Maryland are going to vote on whether or not to legalize gay marriage. And one of the people who was against this said, we didn't get to decide how marriage was described in the Bible, so who are we to decide for ourselves now? Okay. Now, scientists are supposed to be a little more flexible and they're supposed to question things a little bit more than that. But at the time, there was no strong differentiation between science and religion. The function of science was to exalt the Creator by describing His creation. And then we're back to our old friend Lamarck, who came along 50 years after Linnaeus. And Lamarck, interestingly enough, was not a field biologist. Linnaeus was out and about the field, except for one mysterious time when he kind of disappeared and nobody knew where he was for a few weeks. But during the time that he was gone, the ichthyologist in the Netherlands, who had published an alternative approach to classifying things, mysteriously fell into a canal and drowned. You don't know. Lamarck didn't have anything to do with that because he was 50 years later. But maybe Lamarck realized that if you were out in the field wandering around, you might be exposed to competitors. So he stayed in a museum. He was a good museum biologist. And fortunately, there are lots and lots of things in his museum that made him think about the nature of the world. And most importantly, these were the fossils. Now, all these things that are not around anymore. And we went through this yesterday, that he said, okay, there are all these fossils that weren't there before. And then there are all these collections that I have in the museum of things that are alive today. And he looked at them, he looked at the invertebrates in the natural history collection, and at the time, there was really no good protocol for preserving and transporting soft-bodied invertebrates. So his collection of invertebrates at the Natural History Museum was heavily biased to arthropods and mollusks. And all of this protective stuff. So he looked and he said, boy, you know, the species that are around today are really protected against the environment. There are species that aren't around now that used to be around. So he decided that some things that were here once upon a time are no longer here, and other things are here instead. Therefore, we're not living in a static biosphere. The biosphere is changing in some way. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, he decided that because current species have the ability to take care of themselves, we have to assume that nothing ever goes extinct. Now that's not, I mean, we don't believe that's true. We don't believe that that's the only interpretation you can draw from that observation. But that's the inference that he made. So we have to have a theory of transformation of species, not just a theory of once upon a time there were 12 billion species and a lot have gone extinct and we only have 6 million now. So that would have been Plato's idea. There were lots of species once upon a time when the world was perfect, and human beings have changed the planet and things are dying away. And this is all really bad, and we should stop doing anything to the planet. Okay, now, there is, of course, a strong environmentalist philosophy that is exactly that. So there are modern conservation biologists who believe that once upon a time the biosphere was okay, then human beings have screwed things up. So if we just go back to the same kind of lifestyle we had in the 4th century, the biosphere would be okay and we return to perfection. But somehow they imagine that if we go back to the 4th century, we can still have the internet. Okay, now if we go back to the 4th century, I would have died of appendicitis when I was 21. Most of the women in this room, half of the women in this room would already be dead. The rest of you would be alive, but you would be pregnant with your 7th child. Somebody of Walter's age would be an incredible survival story. How could that possibly have happened? People would be malnourished. They would have broken bones that were not set properly, so half the people would be crippled in one. It was not, the 4th century was not a good time, in fact. But that argument, that sort of, again, this is a kind of nostalgia for a past that never existed. There never was a time when there was a perfect biosphere at the internet. And that's one of the reasons that, in fact, right-wing politicians are correct when they reject that kind of environmentalist philosophy. But then they use the same quality of philosophy from a religious standpoint to say that blah, blah, blah. That's one of the reasons we need thinking scientists in the world. Our responsibility to survive, to society is to tell people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. Okay. So Lamarck reasoned that nothing ever went extinct. Come here, you. But if nothing goes extinct, and yet the biosphere is transformational, what is left? Well, what is left is that species change. Species evolve. And species always adapt. They're always capable of adapting to something else. And that something else always involves having characteristics that allow you to deal with your environment. So species are not immutable, but that also makes the issue of what species are, the nature of species, more complicated. Because if species can change over time, if they can evolve, then they're not going to have sharp boundaries. Now, how do we describe a circle if some circles can transform themselves into squares over time? Then the definition of a circle becomes much more problematic. It's something that was round once upon a time, but then maybe it changed into something else. So this makes the whole issue of species, what species are, much more complicated than Lamarck realized. So all Lamarck did was to say, the theory of stasis is gone. And in its place is a much more complicated notion about what species actually are. Lamarck still, however, had a classification view, a classificatory view, that used the scala naturae. The only difference was that he then believed that things could adapt upwards, things could change and progress and get better get more complicated, do more things for themselves. So he still had this idea that every protist was trying to become an invertebrate, every vertebrate was trying to become a fish, every fish was trying to become a frog, and so on. And that idea keeps coming up over and over again. All of orthogenesis was based on the idea that independent lineages were all going through more or less the same kind of progression into increasing complexity. And we even have remnants of this today when people talk about higher organisms and higher groups and lower groups and primitive species and advanced species and things like that. We have not completely gotten rid of that, even though we're now 150 years after Darwin. Now, the fact that these things could change meant that Platonic essentialism was in trouble as an explanation for the nature of species. It wasn't completely gone until Darwin came wandering in. And Darwin was an exceptionally clear thinker and a deep thinker about many, many things. And yet, one of the things, he was very clear that evolution was all about origin of species. That's why it's the name of the book, right? However, Darwin was not exactly that clear about what species really were. So on page 179, he says, why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well-defined? In that passage, he's saying, no, species are self-evident. But 130 pages before that, he had said, well, whether these organisms represent more than one species is kind of, we'll just accept the opinion of a good naturalist. A species is what a good naturalist says it is. That doesn't really sound like a strong evolutionary principle. Okay? This is trust me, I know what I'm doing. Like I said yesterday, when I was a youngster, I would get this from the old guys. Young man, I've been working on this group for 30 years and I know what a species is. How dare you think that you could do any better? So, okay, that's a species. Is that a different species? These different species? Or are these just variants of one species? And Darwin was saying, well, you have to be a naturalist who's worked with these for 30 years to be able to tell whether that's all one species or whether that represents different species. So that doesn't really help. That doesn't really clarify things too much. But then Darwin did something else. This is a picture of a phylogenetic tree. It is the only illustration that ever appeared in any edition of The Origin of Species. The only diagram that he ever produced. This marked the end of the Scala Naturae in terms of evolutionary theory. But he did not make the Scala Naturae go away in biological sciences or biological education. Most of physiology, most of ecology is still based on a Scala Naturae, that there are higher and lower, better and worse, more or less efficient, more complex or less complex things. But this allowed the possibility of change. So by the end of The Origin of Species, Darwin had given so many different species concepts and talked about so many different ways that it could be confusing that he ends up saying, well, let's just say that species aren't real. Now, he's just written a book called The Origin of Species. He's just written 484 pages about how species evolve. And at page 485, he says, well, maybe species are just artificial. Well, you got one thing right. Genera are artificial. Even if they're monophyletic, they're artificial. How many species should be in a genus? Where do you cut the phylogenetic tree? That's completely arbitrary. And there are no mechanisms that operate at the level of genera. But there are mechanisms that operate at the level of species, so we really ought to know what they are. And Darwin wrote 484 pages about species and then ended up saying, well, maybe we should just say they're all artificial and move on. What? No. All right, why was it difficult? Well, it was difficult, and Darwin started saying that, said that, because he was aware that physicists and chemists, the real scientists of his day, the real natural philosophers of the day, would not accept the notion of species that could evolve. And the reason for that was because at that time the word species was applied to things like hydrogen. And so that's what Louis Agassiz, who was the first curator of the Natural History Museum at Harvard, very famous creationist, they stood up and said, if species are real, they cannot evolve. If they evolve, they are not real. Because the only real species were things like hydrogen, which don't evolve. Hydrogen has an unambiguous, unchanging, universal definition. Any atom of hydrogen anywhere in the universe, no matter how or when or where it was produced, has precisely the same properties. But if we went to Mars and found something that looked just like a tiger on Mars, we would still give it a different name because it originated in a place and time that was different from the origin of tigers on this planet. So this is something that's different about evolution. But these were the only real species, were things that were categories. They had their own categories. They were natural kinds, is another way of putting it. And these were the only kinds of species that physicists and chemists would accept. So Darwin was trying to avoid some criticism by saying, okay, well maybe the biological things aren't exactly like hydrogen. Let's just not worry about that and let's have some fun with natural history. But, see, you can define what an element is, what an atom is. But there are no definitions like that for all the biological entities that we call species. So instead of having something like this, which is actually, it's very cool, but it's actually pretty simple. I mean, atoms are, compared to this, you have to have a lot of penny physicists and chemists. What a dull world they live in. We get to look at all this kind of stuff. I mean, when was the last time you saw an atom of gold eating an atom of hydrogen? They don't do that. They don't really behave to. They don't do anything that's really cool. Okay. The other thing about it is every atom of hydrogen is the same. But, the atoms of a species, the members of a species, they're not only are they not all the same, none of them are the same. The more closely we look at clones, for example, the more we realize that even clones aren't all exactly the same. Not only that, but sometimes our species evolve. Hydrogen doesn't evolve into something. Hydrogen, doesn't become oxygen. But our things evolve and they change over time. There's never going to be a period of time in which hydrogen disappears and is replaced by some other element. And sometimes we can even see this happen. We actually see our basic units changing into something else. So, in fact, Darwin didn't solve the problem of what species are in practical terms. He solved the problem what species are, how the concept of species functions in evolutionary theory. But he didn't solve the question of what species are. This is a more practical question. And that means that beginning in the 1930s, there was this enormous explosion. There was an entire industry of species concepts. And there's a huge literature in species concept. And there were a number of different categories of species concept. One is the notion of species as reproductive units. Now, Ernst Mayr did not steal John Ray's species concept. Ernst Mayr stole Theodosius Dobzhansky's species concept. Dobzhansky's the one who stole it from John Ray. So that's how the biological species concept ended up being associated with Ernst Mayr. It was two series of thefts, not just one. The nature of science. And this is the biological species concept. Okay, reproductive isolation, reproductively isolated from other groups, and interbreeding within your group. Easy to remember, easy to write down on examination, easy to teach. Sounds like a good idea. I mean, reproduction is important. If you don't reproduce, your species disappears. So reproduction of some kind or another is important. The problem is that every time somebody brought forward a counterexample to the biological species concept, Ernst Mayr would modify the species concept. Instead of saying, oh, my species concept doesn't work, he would just say, oh, here, I'll just tweak it a little bit. And every time he tweaked the species concept, it got more fuzzy and it created more problems to solve. For example, if they are actually or potentially interbreeding, well, what does potentially interbreeding mean? Okay, I mean, rose bushes are potentially interbreeding with horses, right? In some cosmos. But chances are they're really never going to try that out. There are lots of human beings that are potentially capable of interbreeding with each other, but most of the potential reproductive combinations among human beings on this planet are never going to be tried. And it's highly unlikely that everybody in this room is going to interbreed with 10% of the rest of the humans on this planet.
You're having a problem with this guy, he has to restart.
Oh. How much did they miss?
No, they didn't miss. So the quality of the image was not very good. But it just happened. He asked if we could
Okay. I'm going to wait for a second to improve the image in Moringa. It may just be me. As the week goes on, I look worse and worse. At home, it doesn't happen at home because at home I have a picture of myself on the wall, and every day it looks worse and worse. Should I play some music? It's better than singing. If I started singing, you would all run away. Can I just keep going no matter what? Even if the image is bad? Okay, we're back. I've been told that I look better than in real life now, at least in Moringa. Okay, so here's some squirrels in Vancouver, here's some squirrels in Calgary, Canada. They're on opposite sides of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, we call them the same species, which means they ought to be potentially interbreeding. Are they ever going to interbreed? No. So does that mean that because they actually are never going to interbreed, we should now call them different species? Okay. Plus, we understand that in the real world, there are lots of cases in which representatives of different species actually do interbreed. Okay. Most botanists, especially botanists who study composites, have absolutely no use for the biological species concept because 50 to 75% of their species are all the result of some sort of hybrid speciation. But even among animals, there are lots of cases of exotic hybrids. Influenza, as an example of hybridization events. And what about these things that are extinct? Are they no longer species because they're extinct? And they can't potentially interbreed with anything. What about things that are only known from museum specimens? These things are not going to interbreed with anything. They are not potentially interbreeding with anything. Does it mean that they don't represent a species or they're not members of the species? No. That's kind of silly, right? Well, what about reproductively isolated? Well, just how reproductively isolated do you have to be? And for how long? Okay, if I go and live on a desert island for 20 years, starting when I'm 15 years old, and then I come back to civilization, I'm 35 years old, am I reproductively isolated from humanity? What if a group of human beings is isolated for 100,000 years? Somewhere in the jungles of a remote island in the southern Philippines. And then they're quote unquote discovered. Are they not human beings? We call them a different species. Hard to say. How many hybridization events must there be? How much interbreeding or how little interbreeding must there be before you say, well, this is just an accident between two species, as opposed to this is a rare reproductive event within one species. We even have hybridization events between really distantly related organisms, members of what taxonomists call not just different species, but different species in different genera. So the hybridization doesn't even necessarily involve things that are that closely related. And even if we put it in a phylogenetic framework, it doesn't make anything better. Now here's an example of two species of orioles, the Baltimore oriole and the Bullock's oriole. They hybridize on a regular basis. They're not sister species. They are not each other's closest relatives. That means that they're definitely different species, evolutionarily, phylogenetically, but they hybridize readily. What does that mean? Does it mean that these two things by the biological species concept, those are the same species? If they're the same species, then this entire clade becomes one species, even though the other four members in that clade don't hybridize with anybody else. So, I mean, what, that's all one species, even though some of them don't interbreed and some do? More problems with the biological species concept. Viruses, I mean, we don't even know if viruses are alive, or if they are alive, we don't even know if they are part of the same origin of life that's represented by all the other living things on this planet. They may be a completely different origin of life. What about clones? Parthenogenetic organisms. Gynogens. I mean, the Amazon molle is a really cool thing. Parthenogenetic species, all female species, okay? Doesn't mean that males are not functional. Doesn't mean that they have not found a use for males. In fact, they found a use for males of another species of molle. Those males are necessary for stimulating fertilization of the females. Now, they never contribute anything genetically. They just mate with, but do not contribute genetically to the gynogenetic population. So it's very cool. You have sperm from one species contacting the eggs, the membrane of the egg, which initiates self-fertilization and development in the egg, and then the sperm just disappears. Never actually contributes genetically to the sperm. What about bacteria and this biological species concept? I mean, we do, at some point, if we have a universal species concept, it should apply to 95% of the species on this planet, which are protists of some sort, either eukaryotic or prokaryotic protists. Gene transfer. See, the more and more we learn about what's going on reproductively with 95% of the species on this planet, the more we realize that the biological species concept really does not work very well for much of anything at all. So the interesting thing about the biological species concept is sociological. How did it get to the point that everybody teaches their students that that is the species concept? The University of Toronto, which has an entire department of ecology and evolutionary biology. First year biology course, 2,500 students every year are taught that the biological species concept is the species concept for evolution. How did that happen when it obviously is crap? So reproductive isolation in prokaryotes, of course, has to do with genes. It doesn't have to do with organisms. So it can't have to do with species. Okay, that's a mess. Now, one of the things that most people don't realize is that parallel to the establishment of the biological species concept by Ernst Mayr was an alternative species concept proposed by George Gaylord Simpson, who was a contemporary of Ernst Mayr's. In fact, at one time, they taught a graduate course in evolution at the American Museum together. So they were both teaching in this course, and they never talked to each other about that course at all. They never had coffee together. They never talked about the curriculum. They never attended each other's lectures. And in the 1970s, when Ernst Mayr decided to have a celebration of the founding of the new synthesis, because he was the only one, almost the only one left alive, it was an attempt to establish his legacy. So he had this conference at Harvard, and ahead of the conference, he sent out invitations and a questionnaire. And one of the questions on the questionnaire was, when did you first realize that the biological species concept was the foundation of neo-Darwinism? And George Gaylord Simpson wrote back, never. And Simpson had a species concept that was much more evolutionary, much more all-encompassing, but much less easy to apply in individual cases. So the thing the biological species concept had going for it is that if you take two mammals, a male and a female, and you put them together and they cannot reproduce, you know they're members of different species. So the biological species concept is like a one-tailed statistical test. If they cannot interbreed with each other, they are different species. If they do interbreed with each other, maybe or maybe not, they're different species. But over here, there is a decisive test. There is a way to use it in a decisive way. So that feels like you can do something. Simpson's evolutionary concept was that species are lineages of common ancestry. Now, Darwin, at one point in Origin of Species, Darwin defined species as communities of descent. And that's pretty much what Simpson was saying as well. But there are problems with that, of course. So the focus is on evolutionary history. That's a good thing for if we actually think the biosphere has evolved. But there are some problems. The first of it is, what is an evolutionary tendency and fate? That sounds like every species knows where it's going. And as long as each species is driving on a different highway, then it's a different species. But what is that? I mean, it's one of these things that sounds really cool unless you think about it for a microsecond, and then you go, what? So here's the phylogeny, and these represent characteristics. These represent apomorphies that tell you that evolution has happened, speciation has happened. Now, the problem is, how do we divide up that phylogenetic tree? I'm going to come back to that later. It turns out there are a lot of different ways to divide up a phylogenetic tree into units that we might want to call species. But one version, one practical application of Simpson's concept was what's called the phylogenetic species concept, which is a species is the smallest group that can be diagnosed with an apomorph. All right. Well, just any apomorphy, or a really significant apomorphy, or an apomorphy that has to do with reproductive isolation. What does that mean? So, if we have some human beings that have a lot of eyelashes and some human beings that don't have very many, and it's heritable, does that mean that those are two different species of human beings? I mean, that's an apomorphy. They're diagnosable. And then, how many species are here? Every time you have an apomorphy evolved, you have to name a new species. Or is there something more or something different involved in how you recognize species phylogenetically. And this I'll come back to, and there's a technical answer to that we'll come back to. So, here are things that are diagnosed by one trait change. But if we name a species for every apomorphic trait that evolves, then there's this enormous number of species out there, most of which we have no evidence for. We have no evidence that there was ever a species that had only that, and then one that had only that, and one that had only that, and one that had only that. Because when we list the apomorphies on a branch in a phylogeny, the sequence that we put them on the tree isn't necessarily thought to be the temporal sequence in which those traits evolved. We don't actually know. All of these could have evolved at once. These could all be part of a major rearrangement of the genome. One event that shows up as 4 apomorphic changes to us. We don't know the mechanism underlying character change a lot of times. Okay, what if we decide to use a different criterion for deciding what the species are? Okay, this is the part of the DNA barcoding world. You take this little tiny mitochondrial gene and you decide that it is the universal diagnostic feature for all of life. Okay, first of all, if you believe that one little fragment gene, one little small gene is going to tell you everything about 4 billion years of evolution, you actually don't believe in evolution. And we understand now, because people have been looking at this for a number of years, we understand that this is not true. There are a few groups where this seems to work. There are many groups where it doesn't work very well at all. Not surprisingly, this doesn't work for plants at all. So, but what they were looking for was some percent difference. Just something you could apply. This is like a mathematical formula. And instead of chopping up the world according to apomorphies, you chop the world up into percent difference in one gene sequence. What about evolutionary lineages, the evolutionary species concept, and prokaryotes again? Where you have multiple origins of the same genotype of bacteria. But they all look the same, so unless you actually see this happen in a petri dish, you don't know that they had different evolutionary origins, different historical origins. Under Simpson's concept, each one of them would have to be given a different name, even though they're completely indistinguishable. And then what about reticulations? What about gene transfer? It just gets worse and worse and worse. Now this is why some microbiologists believe that there is no tree of life at the base. The base of the tree of life is just a network, a reticulated network, and there isn't any tree structure at the level of prokaryotes. That's a potential mess. This is kind of what happens with influenza. So you have a network of relationships and you have identical outcomes produced multiple times. Now, since 1940, I told you there's been this cottage industry in species concepts. There are currently about 42 different species concepts in the serious evolutionary biological literature. And there are some categories. There are historical, what we call historical species concepts. Okay? And I'll show you, after we take a break and come back, I'll show you what a mess that is. I mean, that sounds pretty, okay, this is nice and well-defined. Even then, it's not. And then there are all these things called non-historical or non-dimensional species concepts. Now, the only nice thing about all of this is that in the context of the book that we wrote, The Nature of Diversity, one of the themes that we followed was this theme that research in evolutionary biology cycles through alternating phases of what we call discovery and evaluation. Discovery and evaluation. And it turns out the good news is that we can use historical species concepts as a logic of discovery, and we can evaluate them. They can be hypotheses of things that might be species, and we can evaluate them using the non-historical species concepts. That's the good news. We can actually put these 42 species concepts to work in a research program. The bad news is, other than saying that species are the fundamental units of descent with modification, there is going to be no single species concept out there that's going to apply to everything. So in fact, research in the nature of species is not, is this a species? It is, what kind of species is this? What kind of species are we dealing with in this particular group of things? And we don't have to have this versus this. We can have both of them working together. But that makes the whole process really complicated. And most people don't want to spend 20 years figuring out what the nature of the species they're studying, when all they really want to know is something about its basic ecology or basic physiology. Historical concepts allow us to discover things logically. Say, all right, here's a reason we think this is a thing. And we're going to hypothesize that this thing is an evolutionary species. Now, how do we evaluate our hypothesis, our historical hypothesis that it is a different species? Then we can use things like the biological species concept. Because if our phylogeny says these two things are from different groups, they don't form a monophyletic group, and they are incapable of reproducing, then we know they're different species. Now, here's an example of things we call fire ants. Oh look, South America. Okay. Here's a species that is widespread throughout Brazil, extremely variable across the range. And there are other members in the genus in other parts of South America. Now here's the phylogeny. Everything that has a geographic distribution listed rather than a name was originally called one species. And then this and this were called other species. So now we know that either these two species are all part of this one huge species, or what we used to call Cibissima is actually a complex of species, and that explains why they're so widespread and so variable. Because the way to get a widespread variable species is to combine 5 or 6 species together and call them one thing. Well, now we have a hypothesis. Now we have a hypothesis that these things are actually different species. Now we can apply the non-dimensional or non-historical species concepts to all of those and ask whether or not those differentiated populations are behaving like different species. Are they acting like? One possibility would be that this clade, that these 5 populations actually do represent one species, and that these 2 populations represent different species that have not been described. It's also possible that there's 7 different species. So a lot of different possibilities here, but having a phylogeny means that you have a protocol for testing. So you have to ask questions about these guys, and then you have to ask questions about those. And you can do it. It takes time and effort, but you can do that. So now what you do is you evaluate that hypothesis using the non-historical species concept. Things like reproductive isolation. Turns out that there's no gene flow among those four populations. Seems like they're acting like separate species. They're not talking to anybody else. They're only talking to themselves. What about ecological isolation? Well, it turns out that this species and this species and this species are ecologically distinct from any of the others. They don't interact ecologically. They would never come into contact with each other. And that guy. Then there are some of these that come in only one form and others come in multiple forms. So some are morphologically distinct and others aren't. So it turns out that if you use all of these different non-historical criteria for evaluating these different lineages, you find out that it looks like this one widespread, highly variable species is actually 7 different species. Each one of which has a restricted geographic distribution and a very particular ecology and behavior and reproductive mode and natural history. Now, among other things, that means that if you were involved in trying to develop protocols for protecting fire ant biodiversity, you have a completely different perspective on the world when there are 7 restricted species as opposed to one widespread species. Now, if you destroy 6 of the 7 habitats, you have destroyed 6 out of 7 species as opposed to preserving one population of that species which could potentially go back and recolonize the other areas. So these are some non-trivial outcomes of deciding what a species really is. This is how species function in evolutionary history. They are unique, historically independent lineages that are irreversibly cut off in some way or another from their closest relatives. There's not a single definition of species that works for everything on this planet, other than this. The nature of species we understand with respect to evolutionary theory. How we distinguish species, what the quality of each species is. If there's not one, there never will be just one way to do that. And that's because species evolve. Species, and we'll find out later this morning, the species can be produced in many different ways. And the characteristics, the adaptations, the functions, the attributes of species change over time as well. So it's not surprising that there's not going to be one species concept that works for everything. There might be a periodic table of species concepts, okay, but there's not going to be just one that explains everything. And as I said, not all species are formed the same way, and we'll talk about that, about how species are formed. However, the good news is that we can actually study the quality of species scientifically if you have a combination of phylogenetic criteria for discovering units, entities that might be species, and a set of non-phylogenetic criteria that allow you to evaluate the hypotheses that you have formulated based on the phylogeny. So we actually can study this. We don't have to believe that we're going to find only one species concept. We can use the diversity of species concepts as the way to do interesting research, instead of fighting about whose species concept is better than who else's. And of course, here with Darn said, this may not be a cheering prospect, but at least we won't have to continually go to conferences where people argue about whose species concept is better than who else's. We can actually do something interesting with it. Okay, so let's do a 10-minute break. And I'll come back and continue on. But that's because this is a way of looking at the whole species problem in a very different way. I don't think anybody else has approached it quite this way. Deborah McClellan and I got this idea about this approach to species concepts from some papers that Rick Maiden, an ichthyologist in the United States, wrote. But this is where we talk about discovery and evaluation. Okay. Now, I already mentioned this quote from Darwin, where Darwin, in 1859, most taxonomists thought that the issue that they didn't think there was a species problem because we knew so few species at that time that every one of them looked very distinct. But 100 years later, you have, this is from an article in Science, the journal Science, about species concepts in 1979, and this guy wrote, "Diversity is idiosyncratic, and the search for hidden likenesses is unlikely to yield a unified species concept." So we sort of went from species are self-evident to species don't exist to something like this, where species are, whatever good taxonomists say they are. In neo-Darwinism, there were three major categories of species concept. There are things, the species are reproductive units, species are historical lineages, and then species are just taxonomic artifacts, and we should focus on population dynamics. These, by the 1960s, the notion of species as historical lineages had disappeared completely. So no one was talking about Simpson's evolutionary species concept in the 1960s, 1970s. It wasn't until the late 1970s that Ed Wiley wrote a paper pointing out that Simpson's species concept was really the appropriate species concept for phylogenetic systematics. So by the 1960s and 1970s, we actually had two non-dimensional or non-historical categories of species concepts that were competing. One was that species are reproductive units, this reproductive isolation, and this was reproductive isolation is reinforced by ecological isolation, and this was ecological isolation leads to reproductive isolation. So even though they had different names and different emphases, they actually were more or less the same thing. That what determined a species was the extent to which the environment that they lived in made them separate from other species. So this is another example of the way, not only the way neo-Darwinism eliminated history, but as Niles Eldridge has pointed out, this is another example of the way in which neo-Darwinism completely blurred the distinction between Darwinian and Lamarckian explanations by saying that the environment, the nature of the conditions, is what determined the nature of the organism. Now, what happened then in the 1970s and 1980s with the phylogenetics revolution were a couple of important insights. One was very philosophical. This was Michael Gieslin's seminal paper in which he said, the reason that we're having problems understanding the fundamental nature of species is because we're trying to treat species like they were categories, like they were classes or they were natural kinds. He said, let's think of species as a kind of individual. Let's think of species as collective individuals in the same way that corporations are considered to be individuals for the purposes of things like taxes. So in the United States, and probably in Brazil, a company, in terms of its legal status for paying taxes and things like that, a corporation is considered to be an individual. But it's understood that that individual thing is made up of a lot of individual human beings. And so Gieslin said, let's just think of species as these corporate individuals. And we give them names based on when they originated. We maintain the same name of the company, even though you get a new vice president, new workers come and go. So the individual workers within a species, within a company, change, but the company keeps its name. So he said, that kind of individual has a birth date, it has a lifespan, it changes over the course of its life, it keeps the same name, and then dies. So let's think of species that way. And that was a big breakthrough because that fit with phylogenetic systematics, and Ed Wiley put phylogenetic systematics together with Gieslin's insights to say that Simpson's species concept was the appropriate species concept for phylogenetic systematics. And one of the things that I've always really admired about Ed Wiley was that at that point in time, Wiley could have said, this is the a cladistic species concept. This is the phylogenetic systematic species concept. But he didn't say that. He said, this is Simpson's concept, and we should use it. And that's one of the things that I've always admired about Ed Wiley, is that he's a really good scholar, and he's one of the very few people on this planet who will always give proper credit to other people, to the people who originated the ideas. Ed had a lot of original ideas of his own. So part of it is that, you know, he knew he had his own ideas. He didn't have to try to claim credit for other people's ideas. But that's one of many reasons that Ed Wiley is a very special colleague and friend. Now the problem is that evolution is a historical phenomenon, like cosmology and astronomy. And in historical sciences, there are no things that are called intentional definitions. That is, there are no definitions that are based on unchanging qualities of the entities involved, because everything evolves. That means that whatever is important in the study of that area of any historical science, the basic parts that are important have to be discovered. They cannot be named beforehand. This is one of the things that makes physics seem so cool to a lot of the public, is that physicists can, it seems like a physicist will just walk up, write an equation and say, if we go look here, we're going to find this kind of particle. And then they find it. That's very cool. But that's because they're working in an area of the universe, or part of the universe, that's made up of categories of things that have definitions. Biology's not like that. So you have to discover the things that you need that are important. But the mechanisms, the methods that we use for discovering things are not infallible. They're not perfect. So that means that we also have to evaluate what we find in light of our theory to determine our progress. And so we go through these cycles of discovery and evaluation, discovery and evaluation. And Arnold Kluge, a herpetologist and one of the founders of the phylogenetics movement, was the first person to talk about that as being the way historical sciences operate. So after the eclipse of Darwinism, after the phylogenetics revolution initiated the whole process of bringing evolutionary biology back into the Darwinian framework, this is what we have with respect to the species concept. We have historical species concepts that all give us ways to discover things. And we have non-historical species concepts that give us ways to evaluate things. The historical species concepts do not allow us to evaluate anything. The non-historical species concepts, like the biological species concept, give us no way to discover anything. I mean, imagine this for the biological species concept. You're a professor, a student comes into you and shows you two insects, two beetles. He says, are these different species? He looks at them and says, species are reproductively isolated or potentially reproductively isolated lineages. Walks away. That's his explanation. That doesn't help. Okay. That's the evaluation. That's the answer to a different question. The question, that is the answer to the following question. I have determined that these represent two different lineages. Are those different lineages different species? Then you can apply the biological species concept as one of the tests for what you're doing. So it turns out that both categories of species concepts are necessary, but neither is sufficient for telling you whether or not you're dealing with one species or more than one species in a collection of organisms. Within discovery modes, remember, I told you that our discovery modes aren't necessarily infallible. Discovery modes in phylogenetic systematics are based on using phylogenetic trees to generate hypotheses of entities that we think, lineages that we think might be different species. Now, phylogenetic trees are pretty simple. They only have two parts. They have branches and they have characters. So there are apomorphies and there are branches with nodes. So if you have only two variables, the system is made up of two variables, you can have three different possible criteria. You can count the number of branches, you can count the number of character changes, or you can count the number of branches with character changes. So there are three different logical ways, protocols for chopping up a phylogenetic tree into entities. And interestingly enough, phylogeneticists have proposed all three as being the historical species concept. So we actually have three different historical species concepts out there. Count the number of character changes, count the number of branches, or count the number of branches with character changes. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Ed Wiley's evolutionary species concept is the most conservative, because you can't call something a separate species unless it is a separate branch with a character change. So it's the most conservative in terms of counting the number of different entities on a tree. But interestingly enough, that turns out to be the phylogenetic-based concept that is most inclusive with respect to the possible number of mechanisms for forming species. The other two actually have restrictions, they have assumptions in them that eliminate the possibility of certain kinds of speciation. So ultimately, if you're going to use these species concepts to then study the process of making species, you actually want to use this one. But that doesn't mean that these other two are invalid, they're just different. And you have to understand what kind of thing you're doing. So here we have a phylogenetic tree with branches and apomorphies. The cladistic species concept, Joel Craycraft's concept, you just count the number of branches. This tree has 13 species. There are 13 branches, there are 13 species. Dito Cornet's species concept, where you just count the number of apomorphies. And her reasoning is that in order to have an apomorphic change is a character fixation. You cannot have character fixation without irreversible lineage splitting. Therefore, every apomorphic change is a speciation event. There are 15 such changes on this tree. There are 15 species represented by this tree. And Ed Wiley's phylogenetic or evolutionary species concept, where you only count branches with changes, says that there are only 10 species represented by this tree. So these are three very different hypotheses about how many species are represented here. For example, species G here, according to the cladistic species concept, that's a distinct species because it's a distinct branch, even though it doesn't have any characters that make it diagnostically distinct from this ancestor. And Wiley would say, if this is not diagnostically distinct from this ancestor, I'm going to assume it is this ancestor. Now, that means that Ed Wiley allows, his species concept allows the possibility of species F being produced by a mechanism of speciation in which the ancestor continues to survive after the speciation event. Whereas the cladistic species concept says every time you have a branch, the ancestor disappears. So that's what I mean about that some of the species concepts being more flexible, being more inclusive than others. And this is a potential problem for counting species when you have polyclones, when you don't have diagnostic features. And later on in 2 weeks from now, when I do the advanced course, this will also come up when we start to study species of hybrid origin. So it can become very, very complicated very quickly. And here you have a situation in which you have an ancestor represented by A that produces two descendant species, but the ancestral species continues to exist. So your phylogenetic tree is what we call a hard polytone. And you have three species, one of which is the ancestor of the other two. And the other two each evolved from different populations of that persistent ancestor in different ways. The alternative would be to say we have 2, 4, 6, we have 7 species represented here. And 5 of those 7 species are historically and structurally identical to each other. The non-dimensional or non-historical species concepts include the biological species concept, the recognition concept, which is essentially the sexual selection-based species concept, genetic species concept, ecological species concept, the barcoding species concept, the morphological distinctness, blah, 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 blah. There are many of these things. Now, the nice thing about them is that they're all potentially valid, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So if you find out that something is a biological species concept because of extreme sexual selection, it's also a recognition species, blah, 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 blah. So this allows us to begin to build a picture of the different kinds of species and different qualities of species and different qualities of speciation. So are some of these non-dimensional species concepts redundant? Are genetic species always biological species? Are ecological species ever also sexual selection, recognition species? Are they internested? Do recognition species always begin as ecologically segregated species? So that's a different kind of question, a different kind of research program that you can begin to ask about species concepts. And all of these, depending on your particular interest, these are a lot of different kinds of research you can do, and you don't have to ever believe that there has to be one right answer. There's only the answer that is appropriate for the system that you're studying. Okay, so now we'll, oops, I should. All right. Now I'm going to start talking about ways in which we can study the origin of species. See, it's taken us all this morning up to this point just to figure out what species are. But ultimately, the reason we want to know what species are, we want to be able to figure out which things are distinct species, is because in evolutionary theory, what we really want to understand is where do those species come from? How do species evolve? How does one species become another? Or how does it produce descendant species? And we are now freed from that. Okay, but it's an interesting cost-benefit analysis. The benefit of adopting the approach to discovering and evaluating species that I've just spent a long time talking about, the benefit of that is that we don't have to fight pointlessly about species concepts anymore. But the cost of that is that actually figuring out what you have is a much more lengthy, more complicated process than just pretending that just grabbing some criteria and saying, I'm going to call these species. So we don't have to worry about the fact that there's a single definition. There's also not only a single way that species can be produced. Now, Ernst Mayr, who believed that there was only his species concept, also believed that there was only one way that species were produced. But it turns out that the world is actually more interesting than that. Okay. One of the things that Darwin recognized was that the production of species, the production of new species, always has a geographic context. So we're always going to talk about how species are localized in space in order to understand how they change through time. So the study of speciation is essentially a study of the way space and time interact in the production of diversity. So this is here I'm pretending to be a physicist. So you have this an ideal ancestral situation, ideal ancestral geographic distribution, ancestral form. It's a perfect sphere. Something happens that transforms this ancestor into two descendants, or transforms it into one descendant and a modified version of itself. So one of the things about speciation, about the production of species, is it is an additive process. At the end of speciation, you have more species than you had before. And they're different. At least one of them is different. celebrate diversity. Now, here's what we really want to do as biologists. We want to know how all those different cats came into being. Why are there how can there be so many different species of cats in South America? And secondarily, we want to know how there can be so many species of cats in South America and we never see them. So you never hear about people saying, well, I want to see the big cats, so I'm going to go to South America. No, they always go to Africa because they're out